It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution in the mode prescribed by law, and that you shall be transferred to the custody of the warden at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And further, on the 12th day of January, 1997, your body shall be subjected to shock by a sufficient current of electricity. May God have mercy upon you. Mr. Bates, take Mr. Pike into the house.
Can I please have my mom before I go?
Mr. Bates, please hold Miss Pike in the dock.
Please, let me just love my mom.
Please hold Miss Pike in the dock.
Oh, and I love you. I love you too. And I love you too.
The story of CHRISTA Pike, already steeped in darkness, had reached its defining chapter. The trial and sentence were not just a record of crime and punishment. They were a mirror reflecting the stark choices of a society trying to reconcile justice with youth, trauma, and the unfathomable depths of human cruelty. She was young, broken, and brutal, a girl molded by neglect, trauma, and rage, yet capable of unspeakable cruelty. In the span of a single night, CHRISTA Pike's life and Colleen Slemmer's were forever intertwined, one extinguished, the other condemned. Her story is not just a tale of crime, it is a mirror reflecting the fragility of justice, the shadows of human nature, and the harsh edges of consequence. And now, decades later, the countdown continues. Years on death row, appeals denied, a date set, September 30th, 2026, looming like a dark storm on the horizon. Every day she spends behind bars, every letter, every reflection of remorse or rage adds weight to a question that will not leave the minds of anyone who follows her story. Is CHRISTA Pike a monster, a soul so twisted that death is the only fitting answer? Or is she a young woman, failed by a world that should have protected her, whose violence was born from pain no child should endure? The courtroom answered with a gavel, the law with a sentence. But the question remains unsettled, hanging over every conscience that dares to ponder it. What would you have done if the pieces of her life fell into your hands? Could mercy ever reach her? Or is the path of vengeance the only truth left? Think carefully. Because in her story, the line between victim and villain is thinner than you imagine, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Tell us your verdict in the comments. Debate it. Wrestle with it. Because justice is not a simple word, and sometimes the hardest cases are the ones that refuse to end. If you want to uncover more stories of life, death, and the darkness that lingers on America's death row, subscribe and join us again here, on The Last Verdict. Because in cases like CHRISTA Pike's, the final word is never final. And the deeper you look, the darker it gets. It was just after midnight when officers stepped into the woods behind the University of Tennessee campus. Their flashlights cut through the fog, catching fragments of broken glass, footprints, and something darker, something that shouldn't have been there. At first, they thought it was just a fight gone wrong. But then they saw her, a young woman, barely out of her teens, lying motionless under the cold light. Her skin was marked, carved, with a pentagram across her chest. The forest floor around her soaked in blood, the silence heavy with cruelty. The closer they looked, the worse it became. Her skull, crushed beyond recognition. And as they searched the scene, one detail froze every officer on the spot. In the suspect's pocket, they would later find a piece of the victim's bone, kept like a trophy. What could make an 18-year-old girl commit such a brutal murder? Was it jealousy, madness, or the scars of a life that had already destroyed her long before she destroyed someone else? Welcome to The Last Verdict, where we uncover the final moments, hidden motives, and the cold justice behind America's most shocking executions. Stay with us, and remember to subscribe, because tonight, we walk the dark path of CHRISTA Pike, the only woman awaiting execution on Tennessee's death row. CHRISTA Gale Pike entered the world on March 10, 1976, in Beckley, West Virginia, a small town that saw more struggle than promise. From the very beginning, her life was surrounded by instability. Her mother, Carissa Henson, drifted in and out of her life, often lost in the haze of drugs and neglect. Her father, Emil Glenn Pike, was absent, a shadow that never returned. As a child, Christa was restless, unpredictable, and alone. Those who knew her remember a little girl who was bright, yet fragile. A child who never quite fit anywhere. Doctors noted strange episodes early on. Seizures, blank stares, sudden bursts of anger. There were whispers of brain damage, perhaps from birth, or from the chaos she lived in. Whatever the cause, her mind became a battlefield long before she reached adulthood. By the time she was 9, the innocence had already begun to fade. Depression took root. She struggled in school, drifted between homes, and sought comfort in anyone who would show her attention. Each new friend, each fleeting bit of kindness, became something she clung to, as if it could save her. When she finally entered the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee, it was supposed to be a new beginning. A place to learn, to work, to escape the broken pieces of her childhood. But instead of healing, the loneliness followed her there. And within the walls of that program, surrounded by other young people trying to fix their lives, CHRISTA Pike's darkness found room to grow. At Job Corps, CHRISTA Pike arrived searching for a structure, a place to belong. She was smart, striking, and troubled. A storm barely contained beneath a calm surface. There, she met Tatterall Shipp, a quiet boy who kept to himself but harbored a fascination with the occult. Together they experimented with symbols, whispered about rituals, and tested the limits of fear and fascination. But then Colleen Slemmer arrived, bright, confident, and quickly drawing attention. Tatterall noticed her, and something shifted in CHRISTA. A spark of jealousy ignited, subtle at first, then fierce. She watched every interaction, every laugh, every glance with growing unease. What began as idle curiosity turned into obsession, a simmering fire that would soon become dangerous. In the quiet corners of the campus, plans whispered and rivalries formed. Tensions hung in the air, unseen by most, but unstoppable in their momentum. By the time anyone realized it, the seeds of a deadly confrontation had already taken root. The night was bitterly cold, and the woods behind the University of Tennessee seemed to hold their breath. CHRISTA Pike, 18, moved with a strange confidence, a sense of purpose that belied her youth. Alongside her were Tatterall Shipp and Shadala Peterson. Together, they approached Colleen Slemmer, 17, under the guise of reconciliation. They said they wanted to talk, to make peace, to smooth over the tensions that had grown like an invisible storm between them. Colleen, unsuspecting, followed. She had no idea that she was walking toward a trap so cruel, so deliberate, that it would leave a scar on the very history of the campus forever. The group entered a secluded clearing, where the moonlight barely reached, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the snow-dusted ground like silent witnesses. There was a stillness in the air, a pause in the world, as if nature itself sensed the horror about to unfold. Then, without warning, the violence began. 30 minutes of terror, 30 minutes in which every scream, every plea, was swallowed by the cold night and the merciless intent of her attackers. The blows came first, delivered with deliberate precision, leaving Colleen defenseless. She flinched, tried to shield herself, but it was futile. Then the weapons emerged, a box cutter, its blade thin but lethal, and a meat cleaver, heavy and brutal. CHRISTA moved with an eerie determination, her actions methodical, almost ritualistic. Each strike, each cut, was not only an act of physical violence, but a declaration of control, a terrifying assertion of power. And then came the pentagram, carved into Colleen's chest. It was a symbol of fear, a mark meant to terrify, to imprint a sense of darkness over the innocence of her victim. It was not an act of madness, but a conscious, symbolic gesture, a signature left on flesh, a message that would never be erased. Through it all, Colleen pleaded, her voice shaking, her words desperate. She begged for mercy, begged for life, tried to reach whatever humanity might remain in the young women before her. But her words met only cruelty. CHRISTA laughed. It was a laugh without warmth, without reason, a hollow, chilling sound that cut through the forest night and echoed over the clearing. Her laughter was the sound of remorseless intent, of a mind fascinated not by compassion, but by the power of fear. When it was over, CHRISTA did something even more chilling. She removed a piece of Colleen's skull, a grim trophy of her dominance, something to hold, to remember, to display. That night, she spoke of it to others, recounting the events as though they were a story of victory, a tale that cemented her own sense of control. There was no shame, no regret. Only the cold recounting of a horror she had orchestrated with precision. The forest returned to silence, but it was the silence of aftermath, not peace. The echoes of the victim's pleas, the terror, the violence, remained embedded in the frozen ground. That night was a turning point. Innocence destroyed, a young life stolen, and a boundary crossed that could never be uncrossed. It was not the act of a momentary lapse, nor of blind rage, but of calculated cruelty, an obsessive jealousy turned deadly. And in that darkness, CHRISTA Pike cemented her place as a figure whose actions would be remembered, whose crime would haunt the memory of those who knew, and whose story would become one of the most chilling in Tennessee's history. It didn't take long for the first cracks in CHRISTA Pike's carefully maintained facade to appear. Detectives were puzzled at first, trying to understand how someone so young, so small, could commit a crime so brutal, so calculated. Then, a breakthrough came from the most ordinary of places, her own living quarters. CHRISTA's roommate, a girl who had shared late nights and whispered secrets, finally came forward. She told investigators what she had seen, what she had heard. She described late-night conversations where CHRISTA laughed about the murder, recounted the moments of terror, and even boasted about the gruesome trophies she had taken. Every detail was chilling. Every word brought the investigators closer to the truth, but the evidence went far beyond words. When police searched her belongings, they found something no one could have imagined: a piece of Colleen Slemmer's skull, carefully tucked into the pocket of CHRISTA's jacket. It was a moment that made even seasoned detectives shiver. This was no ordinary crime of passion. This was premeditation, obsession, and a disturbing level of detachment from human life. Shadala Peterson, the third person involved in the plot, agreed to cooperate. She described in painstaking detail the sequence of events that led to the murder. Her testimony painted a stark picture: CHRISTA's planning, her coldness during the attack, and the moments after when she seemed almost proud of what she had done. Tatterall Shipp, just 17 at the time, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. His youth spared him the ultimate punishment, a reminder of how the law sometimes differentiates between co-conspirators. But for CHRISTA Pike, age offered no reprieve. The weight of the evidence was crushing. Every piece, every testimony, every small fragment of human bone was a nail in the coffin of her innocence. The detectives who had spent countless hours piecing the story together felt a mix of horror and inevitability. This was a crime that demanded accountability, and the law would pursue it relentlessly. Handcuffs clicked. Metal meeting metal, echoing in the small interrogation room. CHRISTA Pike was taken into custody, her freedom stripped away as the consequences of her actions began to settle around her. In that moment, the world outside the room could see what detectives had known for hours: that justice, in its most unyielding form, was coming for her. The investigation was far from over, but this was the turning point. The taunting, the boasting, the chilling indifference, all of it had led to a moment where the scales of justice began to tip, and for CHRISTA Pike, there would be no escape. March 1996 arrived, and with it, the courtroom that would decide the fate of CHRISTA Gale Pike. The trial unfolded in Knoxville, Tennessee, but the attention it drew reached far beyond the walls of the courthouse. People were captivated, horrified, and confused. How could someone so young commit an act so brutal? How could the justice system respond to such a case? Inside the courtroom, CHRISTA sat quietly, her expression calm yet distant, betraying no outward signs of the storm that raged inside the minds of the jurors, the families, and the spectators. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically, leaving little room for doubt. They described the lure to the wooded area behind the Job Corps campus, the vicious attack, the wounds inflicted, and the chilling detail that a piece of the victim's skull had been kept by CHRISTA herself. Witnesses recounted her boasting afterward, her lack of remorse, and the deliberate, calculated nature of her actions. The defense attempted to paint a different picture. They spoke of her troubled upbringing, the neglect and trauma that had haunted her from infancy, and her psychological instability. They described a young woman shaped by circumstances beyond her control, whose judgment and moral compass had been warped by abuse, neglect, and mental illness. They argued that while her actions were horrific, her age and mental state demanded that the court weigh mercy alongside justice. Despite these arguments, the jury needed remarkably little time. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. CHRISTA Gale Pike was found guilty of first-degree murder. The weight of that verdict hung over the courtroom, a heavy silence falling over all who listened. Friends, family, and strangers alike were left grappling with disbelief, horror, and the cruel reality of what had been done. On March 30th, 1996, the sentence was pronounced. The judge's words carried a chilling finality. CHRISTA Pike, aged just 20, was condemned to death. The original sentence called for electrocution, but in the years that followed, the method was changed to lethal injection, reflecting the evolving standards of execution in the United States. It was an extraordinary, unprecedented sentence. Pike became the youngest woman in modern U.S. history to receive the death penalty, a fact that would etch her name into the annals of criminal justice. The courtroom, once filled with the echoes of argument, now held only the quiet weight of inevitability. Outside, the world reacted with a mixture of fascination, fear, and moral questioning. How could a girl, barely an adult, commit such atrocities? And how should society respond? For CHRISTA, the sentence was not just a judgment of her actions, but a permanent severing of her life from the ordinary world. In that moment, she crossed from troubled youth into a figure of historical significance, a living embodiment of the extremes of human behavior and the unforgiving hand of justice. The gavel struck, the heartbeat of the moment fading into an unyielding silence, and with it, the first step of a long, solitary journey toward a date with destiny that would follow her for decades. For nearly 30 years, CHRISTA Pike has lived behind the cold, unyielding walls of Tennessee's death row. The corridors are silent most of the time, save for the echoing clank of metal doors and the distant footsteps of guards making their rounds. Day after day, the monotony is broken only by the occasional intrusion of a warden or a visitor, and by the slow, unrelenting passage of time. CHRISTA occupies a cell like no other in the state, the only woman on death row, isolated in a world built for men, where the weight of her crime and her punishment are her constant companions. Her lawyers describe her as a deeply remorseful woman, one who has lost herself in violence yet remains tethered to a fragile thread of humanity. They tell of a young woman whose childhood was a tapestry of neglect and trauma, whose mind was never given the chance to fully heal, and whose life was derailed before she even had a chance to truly live. In interviews and letters, they argue that the person behind the crime is not the same person confined to this cell, and that the years of reflection, fear, and remorse have reshaped her in ways the world rarely considers. But even within this seclusion, the traces of her old self sometimes flare. In 2001, a sudden burst of violence erupted when she attacked another inmate in a desperate, failed escape attempt. It was a brief, terrifying reminder that the darkness which once consumed her has never been completely extinguished. In the eyes of the law, it reinforced her dangerousness. In the eyes of those who study her life, it revealed a fractured mind trapped between fear and survival, rage and remorse. Yet in her letters, carefully written behind the bars of her cell, CHRISTA shows another side, one full of trembling uncertainty, faith, and a recognition of mortality. She writes of fear, of the shadow of death looming ever closer, and of hope, small, almost imperceptible hope, that one day, someone might understand the circumstances that shaped her into who she became. She speaks of regret, of the lives she destroyed, and of the long nights when she wrestles with the memories of Colleen Slemmer's screams, the panic, and the finality of her act. 30 years in solitude have a strange effect on a person. Time stretches, compresses, and sometimes disappears altogether. For CHRISTA, each day is measured not by hours, but by the endless repetition of the same thoughts, the same walls, the same unbroken sense of being trapped. Outside the cell, the world moves on. Laws change, new crimes shock the nation, executions come and go. But inside, she waits, a solitary figure in a forgotten corner of the justice system, where the passing years do nothing to lighten the weight of her sentence or the memories that haunt her still. And so she waits, in silence and shadow, caught between who she was, who she has become, and the fate that, for decades, has lingered just beyond reach, waiting to claim her at last. The courtroom in Knoxville, Tennessee, was heavy with tension as CHRISTA Pike faced the consequences of a crime that had stunned the nation. Outside, the winter chill pressed against the courthouse walls, but inside, it was as if time itself had slowed. Every whispered conversation, every shuffled paper, carried the weight of anticipation. Jurors returned from their deliberation room after 2 hours, their faces grave, eyes downcast yet resolute. The foreperson rose and spoke with deliberate clarity, the words slicing through the quiet like a knife. "We, the jury, find the defendant, CHRISTA Gale Pike, guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder." The statement was brief, clinical, but it carried the full force of justice. In that moment, the full horror of the crime, the luring of Colleen Slemmer, the savage beating, the box cutter and meat cleaver, the pentagram carved into her chest, the piece of skull kept as a trophy, was confirmed in the eyes of the law. CHRISTA sat motionless, her expression unreadable. At just 20 years old, she had already traversed a path from a troubled childhood to an infamy that few could comprehend. The court then moved to sentencing. On March 30th, 1996, the judge pronounced a sentence of death by electrocution for the murder charge. Later, as Tennessee updated its execution protocols, her sentence was converted to lethal injection. Additionally, she received a concurrent sentence of 25 years for conspiracy. The sentence carried historical weight. CHRISTA Pike became the youngest woman sentenced to death in modern U.S. history. The stark reality was undeniable. A woman barely past her teens, molded by a childhood of neglect, abuse, and mental instability, was now marked for execution. The courtroom seemed to shrink under the gravity of this moment. Every observer acutely aware of the life that had been extinguished and the life that had been condemned. Legal records and appellate filings later confirmed the details. The jury had weighed aggravating circumstances, including premeditation, the brutality of the attack, and the use of a weapon to disfigure the victim. The Tennessee Supreme Court upheld her conviction, and her numerous appeals citing mental health issues, childhood trauma, and her youth at the time of the crime were rejected. Her attorneys argued that modern standards might view such an 18-year-old differently, but the court maintained the sentence, cementing her place on Tennessee's death row. The psychological contrast could not have been starker. An 18-year-old girl, just stepping into adulthood, had committed a murder so vicious it defied comprehension. Yet the justice system responded with a sentence so absolute it left little room for reflection. The echo of the judge's gavel seemed to reverberate far beyond the walls of the courtroom, a grim reminder that in the eyes of the law, no age or circumstance could undo the horror of the crime. For those who would follow her story in the years to come, this moment marked a turning point, from youthful transgression to historic condemnation. The young woman who once walked the halls of Job Corps as a troubled student now faced the reality of death row, a life measured not in ordinary years, but in the relentless countdown to execution. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind the lingering shadows of judgment, the weight of human tragedy, and the chilling knowledge that in a few decades, if carried out as scheduled, Tennessee would execute its first woman in over 200 years.